good morning, and to welcome everyone. And thank you for joining us for our second webinar. Um, I'm really delighted to see the number of participants we have been having in the past two, and there will be another one on soils today at 2 o'clock. And be sure you keep checking our website. We're posting the webinars as they are organized, and we have some through March 4th, and there will be more coming through April 8th. That will probably be our last webinar or two. So I just want to say thank you. And I want to introduce Frank Bradley and Anna Britzman, because they are members of our Envirothon Resources Advisory Panel. They are on the wildlife team. And so they've been planning webinars and jointly with the aquatics team, because we all know how everything is so interconnected in this world. So we are now beginning to do joint webinars to combine and integrate different natural resources topics. So with that, I'll go back to Frank and his team.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for taking time out of Saturday to be here with us on this Monarch's webinar that we're going to be putting on for the wildlife aspect of California Envirothon. Is Monarch's vulnerability during climate change by Aaron, which is unfortunately unable to make it today due to a family emergency. I myself am Frank Bradley, and Ruby Stahl from Napa RSD will be our other presenter as well. Why doesn't it allow me to go on? Sorry, I'm just trying to make my slides go and they're not moving.
Does the arrow button on the keyboard work?
It worked yesterday for this.
Maybe stop sharing screen and try again.
Maybe.
Or maybe you have to scroll down.
All right, I guess clicking the screen works. So the biographies of the presenters are Aaron Arnstein. Aaron is the Western Program Coordinator at Monarch Joint Venture and runs the Western Habitat Program, which provides free native pollinator habitat materials and technical assistance to landowners in California and Southern Oregon. Aaron has more than 15 years of experience in entomology and is a passionate advocate for invertebrate conservation. She also brings 8 years of experience as a diversified organic farmer and gardener in the California Central Coast region, and is uniquely qualified to bridge the gap between the fields of conservation and agriculture. In her free time, she started the Western Monarch Society of Napa County, which grows and gives away native milkweed and nectar plants to her local community. She's unfortunately unable to be here right now to present, but she was crucial in getting this presentation made. She put a lot of time and resources into the slides, and I know she deeply wishes she was here right now. Going on to Ruby Stahl. Ruby has been working in conservation since 2009. She has a master's degree in conservation biology, a bachelor's degree in environmental studies, and is also a certified professional in erosion and sediment control. Ruby joined the Napa County Resource Conservation District in 2019. Her work at Napa RCD focuses on restoration projects for wildlife, riparian habitat enhancement, carbon sequestration on farms, and erosion control in vineyards. And then going on to myself, Frank Bradley. Frank is the biologist for the Natural Resources Conservation Service in Napa Field Office. His work is primarily centered around threatened and endangered species in and around Napa County, including California red-legged frogs and northern spotted owls. He also conducts pre-construction surveys, worker education talks, and mapping for projects, and completion of various environmental compliance documents. Other assignments include performing forest inventory surveys, assisting with cultural resource surveys, writing forest management plans, and completing cultural resource forms.
Good morning, everybody. I'm really excited to be here to present on the Western monarch biology and migration, just to give you all a background that's going to prepare you for the talk today. Next slide. So monarchs are an indicator species, which is an organism that reflects the condition of the environment around it. We know that if monarchs are on a decline or doing poorly, that is also the condition of the environment that it lives in and all the other creatures that live alongside of the monarch. Next slide. So when we conserve habitat for monarchs, we're also protecting habitat for many other wildlife species within that ecosystem. And we call that an umbrella species. If you can just imagine the monarch holding an umbrella, and all of the other organisms that live there are also protected from the rain by it. It's kind of just a visual, but we like to use that term in conservation biology. Next slide. So monarchs will lay eggs on milkweeds, which is their only host plant, and that's very important to know. If you look really closely at this slide, actually in the background, in the center of it, there's a milkweed plant, because it's pretty much the most important thing for monarch breeding. A female will lay about 300 to 500 eggs in their lifetime, but less than 10% actually make it. The eggs last 3 to 4 days, and then once they're hatched, the caterpillar begins to eat the milkweed plant, and it grows through its 5 instar phases. And the caterpillar lasts up to 2 weeks. And then in its 5th instar, it leaves the milkweed to find a place to pupate. The pupa is also called a chrysalis. And that phase will last about 2 weeks as well. And it really just depends on the temperature. So it's, 10 to 14 days would be pretty normal. Once the adults emerge from the pupa, they live about 2 to 5 weeks in their breeding grounds. And if they're at the overwintering sites, they can live 8 to 9 months. Next slide, please. So there's Eastern and Western monarchs, which are distinct populations. Monarchs living west of the Rocky Mountain Range in North America are the Western monarchs. And these overwinter along the Pacific coast from Mendocino County all the way down to Baja California, Mexico. So here the climate's really similar to that of central Mexico, which is where the Eastern monarchs migrate to overwinter. When they're at their overwintering grounds, the monarchs roost and cluster together to stay warm in large trees like eucalyptus, pine, and cypress trees. The migration is multi-generational, meaning it takes about 3 to 4 generations for the monarchs to make the trip one way. And monarchs can travel between 50 to 100 miles a day. So they begin to arrive in their overwintering sites around September, October, and they stay there till the spring, like February, March, depending on the temperature. And once springtime conditions come around, they begin to migrate to the breeding grounds where they spend the spring and the summer. And due to climate change, the migration's been shifting earlier, which could pose new threats to the monarchs, as milkweed is not readily available yet in the breeding grounds. And there could still be storms coming, like we have this week, snow in all kinds of places. So if the monarchs would have left already, they would be, facing those conditions right now. And that is different than how it used to be. Next slide. So these are real pictures that we took last year at some restoration sites where we planted a breeding habitat. And these are photos of eggs, and they're really tiny and hard to see, as you can tell with my finger right there. They're about 1 millimeter in size and the shape of a football with ridges. When you see the little black dot on the egg, that's actually the head of the caterpillar. So it's close to hatching, and they'll lay the eggs on any part of the milkweed, really. I've seen them on flowers, on the bottom side of the leaf, on the stems, on the top part of the leaf. Really hard to see, but once you get an eye for it, you kind of tune in and can find them. Next slide, please. These are caterpillars that emerged at some of our sites, and they're, I would say, in the 5th instar, pretty close to getting ready to pupate. Next slide. And then here were some pictures of the pupa or chrysalises that decided to find a location behind a winery to get into their pupas. So it's very interesting. Maybe there wasn't enough shrubs or trees around the area for them to find a place where they felt safe. They really, in general, the caterpillars will look for a solid surface protected from the wind and the rain and the sun. And as you can see, it could be anything. It could be a man-made structure, or it could be natural materials as well. So if they are in places that are man-made like this, it's important to educate the people that you're working with on a restoration project, or that this is what they look like. So please don't use these barrel racks or wherever they are until the butterflies have emerged. Next slide. And here's just some of them that did find some natural materials to pupate on. And just another good reason to add diversity to your habitat projects, not just milkweed. You also want to incorporate nectar plants and flowering shrubs, and have a diverse range for them to use the habitat throughout each life cycle. Next slide. So once the butterfly emerges from the chrysalis, this is what's left of it's like a casing. So also very hard to see, but I wanted to show you all a picture. So in case you didn't see caterpillars or butterflies, you can always look for evidence in this remaining casing that'll be left behind. Next slide. This is an adult monarch, and I put this in here to show you that you can tell the difference between females and male monarchs, because male monarchs actually have 2 small black dots on their back wings, and females don't have those. Hopefully you can see that because I can't point. But there we go, Frank, show them. Yep. That is the easiest way to tell them apart. Next slide. So now, I'll pass it to Frank, who's going to talk about the listing and statuses of monarch butterflies.
All right, everybody. This part of the presentation is going to present the listings and statuses of the monarch butterfly. So there's multiple areas in California to nationwide to globally where monarchs are currently listed. The first one is ESA, or the Endangered Species Act, which is managed by the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. And it focused primarily on species in the United States, but also its territories and globally, because a lot of migratory species and whatnot go to other parts of the globe, like South America, whatnot, but they still have a footprint in the United States. This was created in 1973. Now going to state level, there's CISA, which is the California Endangered Species Act, which is managed by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and focuses on primarily species in California, but also in its reports lists species that are threatened and endangered in the rest of the United States, but might not be in California. Like nationwide, the numbers might be crashing or lower, but in California, their numbers might be flourishing, or vice versa. Like they could be listed as threatened or endangered in California under CISA, but not in the Endangered Species Act. So they don't entirely go hand in hand together, but sometimes they do. And CISA was created in 1970. And then the last one for today is the IUCN Red List. And it is an international union of conservation of nature's red list, which is not only deals with the listing of species statuses globally, but also a critical indicator of the health of the world's biodiversity. And this one was actually, surprisingly, I learned this myself, created before the ESA and CISA were created. It was created first in 1964. If you go on to United States Fish and Wildlife Service, they have a part of the website called ECOS. It's a great place to go on. You can search and see if species are listed or not and what their current statuses are. Currently, the monarch butterfly is listed as a candidate species, which is not quite to the level of threatened or endangered nationwide, but it's under a review process, and sometime in 2024, they'll probably make the decision if it will be listed as threatened or endangered or not. And so going on to the report for the California Endangered Species Act, as you can see, they have listings for the state statuses, but they also have their federal listing as well. And these reports come out about once a month or once every 3 months. And as you can see, they have their key, and the monarch butterfly is federally listed as a candidate species, and they acknowledge that as well. But currently it's not listed in the state of California by itself. Another really important thing with monarchs, you're not supposed to touch them under pretty much any conditions. Even dead monarchs you're not supposed to, unless if you have a scientific collecting permit. This went into effect for monarchs October 1st, 2018, and it's just a process to help protect monarchs further. And so people that have this permit, they can do research, they could collect corpses and remains of monarchs after they pass away, can be used for testing, all that stuff. But if you find one in your garden, I highly recommend do not touch it, just let it be. And going on to the IUCN Red List for monarchs, the migratory monarch butterfly is considered endangered globally, according to IUCN's Red List. But I did look up the monarch butterfly itself, which is interesting, the non-migratory one, and it's currently of least concern.
Okay, I did see somebody had their hand up, but we're gonna actually hold the questions till the end. So if you have questions, you can write those down and we'll address them when we're done with the whole talk. And because Erin's not here, we are going to present for her. And so I'm just gonna go through her presentation, part of it, and then Frank will cover some part of it as well. So we know I'm going to be talking about anthropogenic impacts on monarchs. So anthropogenic just means that these impacts are all induced by humans and they're not just natural causes on the monarch butterfly. Next slide. We know that monarchs aren't alone in experiencing the population declines and threats. There's other insects and wildlife species that are also suffering from the same causes around the whole globe. For instance, like the rusty patch bumblebee has declined 80% in the past 20 years. 28% of bumblebee species are threatened. 17% of North American butterflies are at risk. And this can be attributed to the loss, degradation, and fragmentation of habitat, along with other factors like climate change, pesticide use, and invasive species. So I'm going to go into all these causes of decline because these threats add up to show the full picture, and it's important to talk about them as a whole. We can't just get into climate change and not talk about all these other things that are really painting the full picture of why this is happening. Next slide. So research suggests that one of the biggest drivers of monarch population decline is habitat loss, specifically in the United States breeding grounds. Less than 1% of original prairie in North America is actually left. Additionally, scientists estimate that we've lost more than 860 million milkweed stems from the Midwest, with 98% of that loss occurring in corn and soy fields. Because before the introduction of herbicide-tolerant corn and soy, common milkweed actually grew abundantly between crop rows together with the crops. However, since the introduction of Roundup-ready corn and soy, milkweed has disappeared from the agricultural landscape. So the loss of milkweed in these areas have had a significant impact on the eastern migratory monarch population. Next slide. Gathered together, cropland would take up more than 1/5 of the 48 contiguous states. Yet the actual land area used to grow food in America is much smaller. It's about the size of Indiana, Illinois, and half of Iowa combined. More than 1/3 of the entire corn crop is devoted to ethanol production. Most cropland is used for livestock feed, exports, or is left idle to let land recover. The US is also becoming more urban at an average rate .
Ruby, are you there? You froze.
Frank, maybe you can pick up where she left off or move on to the slides you were going to do.
Yeah, sure. I'll just go on to my slides and we could come back to these. All right, so going to my section of climate change, the bread and butter of this presentation. As you can see, this picture is a huge loss of after an overwintering site. I don't know exactly what caused it, but I can see that there's a lot of that snow, and it probably could have been a snowstorm during a part of the year that, and probably in a part of the overwintering area that was not anticipated and usually probably wouldn't happen.
Sorry about that, guys. I'm actually back. The internet just went out.
Okay.
Sorry, Frank. I was like talking to myself.
All right, no problem. I'll do my global warming slides and we'll go back to your stuff.
Perfect. Sorry
Okay.
about that, everybody.
No big deal. Technology always rears its ugly head at the worst times. Yeah, so going to warmer temps leads to fewer Western butterflies. Warming fall temps are associated with fewer Western butterflies over time, and climate change already affecting butterfly populations across the West. Regular data sets needed to track these changes over time and consider the effects of climate change when planning habitat restoration. And as you can see, based off this heat map of how much the southwestern and western part of the United States is warming up and leading to drought-like conditions and other factors that are hindering the monarch's growth. Direct and indirect effects on monarchs during climate change. The variable effects in climate change on monarchs and milkweed. Direct effects is like growth and survival of the monarchs themselves, but indirect effect is some sort of cause or effect that hinders like the host plants and milkweeds and other aspects that they rely on for their survival. Higher temperatures equal negative indirect effect on monarch larval growth. Predicting effects of climate warming on multi-species communities is very difficult due to the variations in direct, indirect, and combined effects, even at a small scales. Yeah, and like certain temperature changes can benefit some species of like milkweed that they rely on, and others might hurt it as well. All right, with this slide, it paints a really beautiful picture of how we should prioritize habitat in California for monarchs. As you can see, the light kind of toothpastey color blue and that dark brown, the early breeding zone, and the central coast area where they overwinter are the most crucial parts of their habitat in California for the Western population. And then going out, expanding outwards to the rest of the state, you have the priority 2 levels, such as like the South Coast area where they also overwinter, but not as much in bigger numbers. And the North Coast areas where monarchs do not overwinter, and so on. But with climate change and warmings, these areas might shift. So it's really important that we conserve and protect these areas now for the future. And this graph shows the amount of monarchs that have been reported over the last 25 years and the number of monitoring sites. As you can see, in 80s, the populations even off this graph were much higher than even 97 and 98, but those are still much higher than we've experienced over the last 20 some years. And as you can see, the number of sites that are being monitored is going up. but the number of populations, the number of monarchs being reported is not going up at the same time. So it's showing that the monarchs are still struggling, but at least they rebounded a lot compared to where they were in 2020, as you can see on the graph. The climate change effects and overwintering sites, these are some of the main ones, such as like downed trees and limbs. So that's loss of habitat, and extreme winds and rain during like atmospheric rivers, which these pictures were actually taken from the last atmospheric rivers we had in early January of overwintering sites. There are conditions afterwards. And as you can see, the bottom picture, flooding is a big issue as well. And also with more wildfires rearing their ugly head, that's another aspect that you have to keep in mind with overwintering sites being protected for the future. The host plant and plant that benefits monarchs the most, the milkweed distribution is a huge aspect to keep in mind. Currently in east, for the eastern population, the milkweed populations are moving further north, and they're retracting north in midsummer. Showy and green milkweed expansion is currently happening in the south central US and Midwest. So those species of milkweeds are probably more adapted to these warmer conditions than other species, where other species are now having to move more north, where it's about the same temperature as where they currently were in years past. Now in the West, instead of shifting, you're now seeing more of change in milkweed composition and populations, such as the showy milkweed. Its range is contracting, and you're having a species of milkweed called swamp milkweed expanding more in range in the Western monarch population. Anthropogenic impacts. Summary of this: research suggests that climate change, habitat loss, degradation, and pesticide use are the main contributors to eastern and western population declines. Invasive and non-native species is also a huge aspect, along with vehicle collisions and other threats impact population as well. But less is known about this to extent, and long-term monitoring research is needed to better understand these threats. With the eastern monarch population, it's very well researched compared to the western population. The western population needs a whole lot more research and sites being monitored down the road to a point where you could even think about catching up with the research of the eastern population. And this is another huge aspect you have to keep in mind when you are talking about monarch butterflies, especially the ones that reside in our lovely state of California. All right. All right, Ruby,
Okay.
going back to yours.
I'm back. Hopefully I will not lose you all. I turned my camera off just in case. We were talking about land use in the US and habitat fragmentation. And I was just saying that this was another figure that was pretty much the same thing as the previous slide. But it's important to note that there are more than 100 million acres of special use areas and parks and wilderness where commercial activities such as logging, mining, grazing, like you can't do those things. And these are very important to conservation of many wildlife species. Next slide. This slide is about the overwintering sites in Mexico. So before 2009, much of the habitat loss at the overwintering sites was due to logging, illegal logging. And then as more areas started to become protected, habitat loss became more due to climate change and its related impacts after 2009 to the current times. Next slide. In California, overwintering habitat suffers from improper tree trimming, management, disease, and fire. And as what Frank was saying earlier in his previous slide, like we had with this last storm, just like the changing climate and the more intense storms, things like that. The sites in California range a lot in land ownership. So there's some public areas like state parks, and then there's also private residences and even golf courses, which host the overwintering monarch populations. So protecting these areas becomes really difficult because it requires landowner cooperation with all these different stakeholders. And that's always, becomes a little bit more complicated. Next slide. So now we're going to talk a little bit about pesticides. So the term pesticide is used to represent multiple types of chemicals, including insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, rodenticides. And pesticide use is widespread, particularly in home gardens, parks, and crop fields. Next slide. Yeah, pesticides are designed to destroy and control unwanted pests, including insects, weeds, fungi, or diseases. And unwanted is kind of up to the user, right? It's a matter of perception in some cases. Slide. A pesticide can affect non-targeted insects in many different ways. So if a crop is sprayed in one area, it can drift to nearby habitat with the wind. And pesticides can also be released in the dust, contaminate water and soil through runoff and leaching. Some pesticides can remain in the water and soil for many years, and each pesticide and combination of pesticides has different properties and toxicity levels. It's very common for a pesticide to reach a non-target area and to contaminate nearby habitat that pollinators are using. Next slide. Neonicotinoids are one class of pesticides that we need to talk about when talking about insects and pollinators and monarchs. They really became popular in the early 2000s. And they're most applied as seed treatments. And then they're also systemic pesticides. And since they're systemic, they incorporate themselves into plant tissues, including roots, stems, leaves, pollen, and nectar. So they're absorbed into the actual plant material. And because they're also water soluble, they've been found to leach into many waterways and soil, and they persist in the environment and do not evaporate or disperse shortly after application like some other pesticides do. So neonics disrupt the central nervous system of insects and other invertebrates. Sufficient doses causes paralysis and death. Small quantities of neonics are highly lethal, and their systemic movement to all tissues of the plant materials, it does offer really good protection against, unwanted insects and pests, especially during the early stages of plant development, which is why people use them. But a lot of times you get that non-target insect, or you get pesticide drift and contamination, and it ends up in areas or targeting other species that weren't meant to be targeted. And important to note that because of differences between vertebrate and invertebrate nervous systems, neonics are less toxic to vertebrates. Next slide. Because pesticides are such a threat to pollinators, the Xerces Society actually maintains a database of summaries of scientific research articles on pesticides and how they impact invertebrates. So these articles get reviewed and summarized by Xerces staff, and then they highlight the key findings. It's a really good way to learn about the latest science and not to have to dig through all these lengthy scientific articles to find, different conclusions. So this is something, if you're interested, you might want to explore, and it's probably in your resources package. Next slide. Another threat to the monarchs are invasive species, because they have the ability to outcompete native plants, reducing the biodiversity and creating monocultures. Even though some of these also provide nectar for adult monarch butterflies and other pollinators, they often outcompete the actual host plants and other food sources that are available during other times of the year. Studies show a decrease in insect biodiversity in areas covered by invasive species when compared to similar areas with native plants that tend to have more diverse communities. Next slide. So some native species are easy to grow and very common in nurseries, like tropical milkweed. And you might think, oh, well, it's a milkweed. Isn't that good for the monarch? But actually, tropical milkweed has a couple of problems that come along with it. And the problems are that tropical milkweed in areas where there isn't a hard freeze in the winter, it won't die back in the fall like the native milkweeds do. And because of that, it can throw off the monarch migration and breeding. And it also hosts a parasite that infects the monarchs. It's called, I'm going to try to say this, Ophryosis electroschiria. I don't expect anybody to remember that, but people just call it OE in short because it's a hard one to pronounce. But that parasite lives on tropical milkweed, and because it doesn't die back, the plant can't reset itself. So it's always persistent, and it infects monarchs and causes deformities and even death in the monarchs. Next slide. So this figure shows OE infection rates, and we can see that infection rates are higher for monarchs in California, are pretty high in California and in the coastal southeast at 67% of all the monarchs that they sampled. So the highest infection rates occur where there is a shorter migration or where there are resident monarchs that do not migrate. A longer migration also helps to reset the population. That's why we see in the Mexico overwintering sites, the monarchs that were sampled over there had much less infection than the ones in California because their migration is much longer and they repopulate. Let's see, I think that was my last slide, Frank.
Yeah. So
Erin's last slide.
all right, so I'm gonna go to how can you help? Some ways where you can help is stop using pesticides, insecticides, and herbicides. Also, you can preserve and protect native habitat and overwintering sites. So certain agencies are trying to work with private landowners and like golf courses and whatnot and get like conservation easements to further benefit monarch populations. You can also be proactive yourself. Maybe your family's house, or you have a balcony or something or whatnot. You can create a pollinator garden. You can plant a lot of native nectar flowers and especially native milkweeds. No tropical milkweeds. If you're not too close to the coast, this is a great thing to do. Another great thing is to educate yourself, stuff like this webinar, the resources we provided. And yeah, the internet's a great place to go down a rabbit hole and learn more about monarchs and pollinators and what is causing problems with them and how to benefit them. And if you want to be even more proactive, there's always citizen science project groups throughout certain counties, the state, and you can help participate by maybe volunteering, giving away like pollinator kits, can assist with maybe surveying monarchs, maybe looking at overwintering sites and help with observations there. There's many different avenues you could go down with these citizen science projects. And thank you so much for watching our presentation and being with us today. We're going to go into the chat and try to find any questions, but if anyone has any pressing questions right now, be more than welcome to raise your hand. Yeah, Carter Yang, if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, you're more than welcome to.
So I actually had two separate questions. So when you were mentioning on the IUCN Red List that the migratory butterflies are marked as endangered, but the non-migratory are least concerned, does the ESA make the same distinction, or do they simply consider the species as a whole?
That's a good question. The Midwest region is responsible for addressing that monarchs are currently a candidate species under the ESA. I'm not entirely sure if they group them. I think they do, but yeah, that's definitely a really good question. The IUCN, they use a lot of non-government agencies and organizations to make their findings for that there's two different species, but perhaps the federal government doesn't recognize that, or if they recognize it, they recognize them as together. So yeah, definitely a great question. I can find more information about that and put it in our resources for later on.
Frank, this is Havita, and I just want to
Yes.
say my familiarity is with endangered and threatened fisheries. And to answer that question, in part, I believe, is that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and others will look at where the populations are low and what the reasons are, and they will define critical habitat. So it's based on species, it's based on geographic regions, and that is how I think they move forward on the protections and plans that will revive the species, if you will.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Like thinking about the fisheries element with like different runs of Chinook salmon and steelhead trout. Some of them are more
Right.
threatened than others, and others aren't even considered threatened or even a candidate. So yeah, that is probably more geographically oriented if you're using that as a example to be based upon.
All right, cool, thank you. And sort of similar question. You mentioned that there were differences in the listing of endangered species between CISA and the ESA. Like, how does that come about? Is there a different process that they take or just different metrics?
The process is pretty similar. It goes under review. Although the timeline is different. It's the first for the Endangered Species Act, the federal one, through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. There's an initial 90-day review, and if that passes, it goes on to a longer process. With the California Endangered Species Act, there is an initial 10-day period after you put a request in, and then it goes further down, and then there's like a 100-day threshold for it's a really lengthy process. One of the resources I've put in is a chart that has the differences about how CISA is different from the Endangered Species Act and how they're similar. That's one of the resources that we have included in our packet for this presentation. And it's a really fascinating process, though. It's very in depth, and by next year is when they're going to make the determination federally if monarchs are going to be listed as threatened or endangered. But yeah, the numbers vary. It's probably because California has a residential population of monarchs as well as ones that overwinter and migrate. That could be one of the reasons why California doesn't address monarchs as particularly threatened or endangered. But as far as the federal aspect, there's might not be enough non-migratory butterflies compared to the migratory ones, and that could be a possibility why they're listed as a candidate species now and not in the state of California.
Great, thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem. All right, we have a question from Sean Ashley in the chat. What solutions for monarch migrating? Okay, hold on. Let me scroll so I can see more of this question. Okay, hold on, maybe that will. What solutions? What's a solution for monarchs migrating before milkweed is out of dormancy? Do you want to take this one, Ruby?
Yeah, sure, I'd love to. That's a really good question. And so the monarch migration is triggered by a change in the climate, like the conditions. Suddenly they think it's spring, it's time to go. We have been getting these like winter heat waves, and that could trigger them to leave too early. And immediately, as an immediate solution, that would be really hard to address, because we can't go and say, oh, stop a storm or stop a heat wave or things like that. That's like working on climate change in the long term. But a good solution that we tell people to do is we need to start focusing on planting earlier season milkweed at our restoration sites. So there's milkweeds, there's different kinds of milkweed species that are native to California and to the region. And some of them emerge earlier in the early spring, and some of them emerge later in the summer. And some of these earlier varieties are really hard to find in nurseries, and they might be out of your county range, natural county range, but that means we need to open our mind to maybe, like, I'm in kind of Northern California, so maybe I would look to the native milkweeds to more Central California and suggest that we plant some of those, because that range is starting to shift. So there's something available earlier. Also, we're going out to patches of native early emerging milkweeds that are local to our county, and we're collecting seed and trying to grow those in nurseries and give those out to people that are interested in having a habitat project, and just really creating a more robust habitat for them that's more adapted to the climate change by having, you know, plants that emerge at different times, just so we cover all the different bases. And that would be like a more immediate solution than addressing, you know, changing climate, which we all need to work on. But for the next season, you know, we can't solve that problem right away. I hope that answers that question.
I saw Jovita, I think that was you. You had your hand raised.
Yeah, thank you. This was a very informative presentation. But one thing I want our students to grow an awareness for is what we can do in working with implementing agencies, whether they're regulatory or public policy, that look at these issues. And when we talk about anthropogenic, I think we should look at what we are doing as humans in terms of allowing the use of pesticides like the neonics, like Roundup Ready, like a lot of the Monsanto pesticides that not only destroy our monarch populations, but also our bumblebees and other bees and other insects. So I think there needs to be awareness of the land users, whether it's the illegal loggers, whether it's agriculture and ethanol, or whether it's development that is destroying habitat. I think those are other factors that I think students need to grow an awareness for, and maybe an action plan for how you can get involved in public policy or local ordinances that restrict the use of pesticides in some areas. And I know that's hugely controversial because EPA just can't get some of these studies done and research on pesticides that do have these impacts because of corporate interest and because of political because of politics. So I just want to inject that thinking to our students so that there is that other dimension on what can be done to control these substances of not, and to come up with substitutes like beneficial insects rather than pesticides. I guess it's not even a question, it's a statement, sorry. But I just thought maybe, I didn't know if you guys had a comment about that.
Oh yeah, no, that's perfect. Yeah, more outreach, the merrier to present these issues to the community at large. Yeah, that there's so many avenues you could go down to attack those issues, such as like maybe with habitat loss, maybe use greener building resources and materials. As far as like agriculture is concerned, maybe more incentives for farmers that grow their crops and their produce organically, perhaps. I know here in Napa County, where I currently reside, more and more wineries and vineyards are trying to get certain certifications, such as like Napa Green, which is kind of like organic. I don't know the exact details of that, but also getting like USDA organic certified as well. And yeah, we're seeing more and more farms and vineyards in this part of California that are striving towards that direction. And also they're finding ways of being able to water their vineyards with less water as well, and during the drought conditions. So yeah, a lot of these vineyards are trying to be more aware of the species that used to reside and still do reside in the vineyards, and also try to make their crop more rugged and climate change proof for the future. So I definitely agree with what you bring up. Outreach is key. Yeah, Ella, if you want to ask a question, or do you want to talk about the question that you put in chat?
Yeah, I was just gonna ask about my question in the chat, if you could answer that.
Yeah, no problem. Ruby,
Sure.
I'll read the question for you. Here we go. Can you explain in a little bit of more detail what overwintering is?
Yeah, so when the monarchs go to their wintering grounds, so for the Western monarchs, like in California, that's the Pacific coast. And the Eastern monarchs, they will go to central Mexico, where it's warm and, less rain and cold conditions and storms. So they will go there and cluster together on these really big trees. I don't know if you've ever seen the pictures of like thousands of monarchs all together. It looks like just one big mass, and they huddle together, and that's what keeps them warm. And the activity level is very low, so they don't reproduce, they leave, every once in a while to go eat some nectar, but they stay very inactive. So when they're in this sort of partial hibernation, they can live like up to 9 months like that, because they're not exhausting all their energy on breeding and traveling. So that is what happens when they're, overwintering. And if you live near some of these sites, like I'm not sure where you live, but throughout California, like Central Coast, there's some great places to visit in Santa Cruz and Pismo Beach and Monterey. There are amazing parks that if you're close enough, I would recommend going to see them, because it's really a sight to see them all clustered together like that.
Okay, got it. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
We have another
Um,
question in the comments. I think you and I, Ruby, can answer this together. Can you explain a bit more the differences between the Western and Eastern monarchs?
Yeah, you can even go back to the migration slide, Frank.
Yeah.
If you want. That was a lot of slides, guys.
It is, yeah.
We'll get there. There we go. Okay. So what really differentiates population is the migration route, is like the main factor. The Western monarchs are west of the Rocky Mountain Range, and if you can see like California and a little bit east of California with all those arrows, that's the Western population, and their migration is, towards the Pacific coast, and they're spending the summer and the winter, summer and the spring in these areas with the stripes. And then as we go a little bit more east on the country, you can see these longer arrows are the Eastern monarchs, and they are like in the center of the country and on the East Coast, and they overwinter in Mexico. And there's also some unknowns within this this image. There's a lot of question marks because it's hard to study monarchs. It's hard to tag them and to track them, and because it takes multiple generations for them to actually achieve the migration. So it's not like you tag one monarch, over in Michigan, and that's the same one that's going to get to Mexico. It'll take them, 3-4 generations to reach the destination. So a lot of unknowns. And there's also other populations that don't migrate, like in Florida, the conditions are just so warm and they just stay there. So, and it's also been reported that in California, there are some non-migratory population, but again, it's a very difficult thing to actually study, because you can imagine chasing monarchs is hard. Does that explain the difference between Eastern and Western? Frank, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, a bit of a statement, but also something that just kind of popped in my mind, kind of like a question. As you can see, there's a clear divide with the Rockies, but then of course when they're going into Mexico, when you have a species that migrates across borders, it can be really hard to get proper research on it, because you're dealing with more non-government organizations, and even more so government organizations, and trying to get the proper literature and research and all that on the same page between countries with the migratory species can be quite complex, to say the least.
Yeah, definitely.
And then I wonder, now I'm asking questions, if these two populations are so distinct and separate, being like a subspecies, where perhaps the western monarchs and eastern monarchs can't breed together, perhaps because they haven't s- been with each other in generations. That'd be a great thing to research, honestly.
Yeah, I'll be
I'm
looking that up.
fascinated thinking about that. Yeah, 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 yeah. Great question, Valentina. Does anyone else have any questions? Want to raise your hand, put them in chat? I'm going to go further back in chat and see if we have any older questions from earlier. All right, doesn't seem like we have any from earlier. Yeah, if you have any questions, you can raise your hand or type in chat for us. How many of you, if you are still here and want to enter in chat, how many of you have actually seen overwintering sites of monarchs? I myself, I'm born and raised in California, lived here my whole life. I've still yet to go to an overwintering site and watch in person. I know I probably should have by now, but this makes me want to do it a whole lot more now, especially seeing how the numbers have rebounded from 2020, but they're still very low compared to what they were in the 80s and 90s. So, but yeah, it's definitely a sight to behold when I see pictures
Mhm.
from brochures and websites and whatnot. Yeah, so yes, Jovita.
I want to ask Frank and Ruby, what does NRCS and the RCD do in terms of conservation practices for farmers and ranchers through the Farm Bill and its conservation title programs? I believe they've made this a priority for financial and technical assistance. In fact, isn't there a partnership with NRCS and the Xerces Society to improve habitat for monarchs and other beneficial insects?
Yes, very good question. Yeah, so the NRCS, we have these conservation practices. There's an application process, and when you go into a contract with us, your conservation plan, which has these conservation practices, go into ranking. And if they rank high enough, people will, like farmers, ranchers, will get funded for their projects, partially funded, not fully funded, through our money, which is government money. And with monarchs specifically, we have some practices that really help them out, such as like hedgerow plantings, which is practice 422. And hedgerow plantings in California, we only use native species that you would find. A lot of times you're getting your plants from local nurseries. So the ecotypes of the milkweeds or the manzanita or whatever you plant is pretty specified for that region and is meant to be planted quite locally. And with Xerces, we work closely with them, especially in the south part of the Bay Area. And what they do is that they have their own research into monarchs and pollinators and beneficial insects, and they create these special kits, such as like a hedgerow kit, which has a list of certain amount of each species, or like a pollinator kit, which helps out pollinator insects. And there's also, I think, a monarch kit specifically that has more milkweeds in it. And these kits, a lot of time, if not all the time, they go hand to hand with our conservation practices. And these farmers and ranchers that want to be more conservationally aware of their properties, they can reach out to us, Xerces, and even their local RCDs a lot of times do events with Cersei's. I'll let Ruby talk more about that in a little bit. And they can get these kits to plant their hedgerows or their pollinator garden, and they get technical assistance, basically like tips and tricks and like how much mulch to apply so you don't have weeds over competing with your brand new plants, and how long you should water them for before they're fully established, where you want to have to water them. Again, unless if you're in drought like conditions, all that we provide. Well, at least NRCS side of things we provide free. I think Cersei's does as well. And then also I had one more point. Also, the huge aspect that makes this possible for a lot of people is the financial backings as well. Like NRCS, our payment rates will pay for around, give or take, 50% of a conservation practice that's being installed. So if people go out and buy, let's say 600 feet of plants to be planted for a hedgerow, then about 300 feet of that is already like paid for, and also the labor aspect is paid for through funding through the NRCS. So yeah, we do a lot of joint efforts together to try to help the community, but every county is different with their needs. We're starting to see a little more hedgerows and pollinator plantings happening in our county, which is lovely. Ruby, I don't know if you want to speak more. I know you deal with more local stuff and you have longer than I have with this
Yeah,
program.
what's interesting in our county is like people have really gotten into monarch conservation in the last few years. I think, since IUCN listed them, and there's been a lot of great grant programs that provide incentives like payments or free materials to people that want to do monarch friendly projects on their properties. And so we work just like NRCS on all these different grants and programs, and they can come from California Department of Agriculture or Wildlife Conservation Board or Napa County Wildlife Conservation Commission. They all had grants in the recent years that we have been able to get to fund hedgerow plantings and conservation cover plantings, and also provide technical assistance to make sure that these projects don't just get implemented and forgotten. And so really just to make them happen correctly and to make sure that
I think your internet went out again, Ruby. All these darn winter storms coming from Canada affecting our internet. Yeah, thanks for that further explanation of hedgerows in the chat, Anna. Greatly appreciate it. Yeah, I guess we'll just wait a little bit, see if Ruby's internet comes back on so she can finish her answer. But if anyone else has any questions, more than welcome to ask.
I think we're losing our audience.
All right, yeah, I see they're starting to slowly drop out. Maybe just give it a couple more minutes, see if Ruby gets back on, and if she's unable to, we'll just end it. And hopefully everyone has a great rest of your Saturday and enjoy the weekend. And hopefully we get some more rain.
Thank you, Frank, and please thank Ruby, and also Anna, I thank you as well for putting on this wonderful webinar on our monarchs. So yes, everybody enjoy the rest of your weekend, and hopefully many of you will come back for the 2 o'clock webinar on soils.
Thanks. And there's one more question in the chat, Frank, if
Oh, yeah.
you don't mind.
Oh, good.
Sorry about that. I got
Oh, no big
out
deal.
of the internet again. It must be the storm. So sorry. But
Yeah.
I was done with my answer.
Okay.
Well, this question's for you, actually.
Oh,
The next one.
okay. What's the question? I
Um,
lost the chat as well.
I've heard there is a chemical milkweed that benefits monarchs. What is that chemical?
Oh, geez. Good question. I don't know what the chemical is, but I've also heard that there's a chemical in the milkweed that helps them find it. That's an also kind of a big unknown. Like people wonder how monarchs actually find milkweed, because there's been really small milkweed patches, like just a couple of plants in a field of other vegetation, and they will find it. And it's just amazing. Like, how do they even find it? And one of the, theories and things people say is that it is a chemical that the milkweed has and releases. But
Is it like a pheromone or something?
yeah, I think so. But I'm not 100% sure. I'd have to look that up. Like what?
It's not a synthetic chemical.
No,
It's
not
organic.
like part of the plant.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Yeah, I'm aware of that. Milkweeds, when butterfly monarchs consume them, it makes them toxic, but I don't know the exact chemical in the milkweed that caused that. And yeah, that's fascinating with that scent chemical that, or it might be a scent chemical that is given off by milkweeds. Basically, it's like the whole like myth of a drop of blood in the pool for a shark, I guess,
Yeah.
type situation. But yeah, pretty fascinating. Yeah, it's amazing that this species has been around for many years and we've coincided with it. We're still learning more about them, and that's a big thing. Like there's always something to be discovered in the world of science and conservation. You never know if you'll be the next person that writes a paper and on something brand new. It's pretty impressive what is happening, especially in modern day technology. Yeah. All right. If no one else has any more questions, we are about towards the end of the presentation time slot, and I hope you all have a great rest of your weekend, and take care and have fun with the rest of Envirothon as well.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you for all your time today.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
All right. I'll make sure to stop this properly.
You guys did great. We
Thanks.
had 32 participants.
Nice.
That's awesome. I just think it's great.
Cool.
So anyways, it's nice to meet you.
Yeah, nice
Erin.
to meet you.
You had great slides, stuff I didn't know, but I didn't know that the male monarchs had 2 little black spots on their wings. And
I'm actually
yeah.
Ruby. Erin had a
Ruby,
family
sorry.
emergency.
That's
We
right.
were
Sorry.
covering for her.
Right.
But
Anyway.
yeah, that was great. And
I know one of your board members too. I know a couple of your board members from
oh, really?
my days at EP.